Warm mist clings to your skin as you push through mangroves where the air smells of salt and resin. The Caribbean Sea stretches endlessly, sparkling like scattered glass under a low morning sun. You hear the distant creak of wooden hulls, their sails patched, and their flags as varied as the tongues of the men aboard. It's the 1600s, and this coastline, what you now call Belize, is barely more than a jagged stretch of lagoons, cays, and dense forest. Few Europeans have dared to settle here permanently. Those who do are men with little patience for order, pirates, privateers, and logwood cutters chasing wealth in a wild frontier. You watch as they hack away at logwood trees prized by European markets for its rich dye. The Baymen, as they call themselves, live by a mix of cunning and courage, trading as much with passing ships as they raid them. It's a tough, sun-scorched life with tropical storms ready to erase their fragile camps in one night. Still, these men carve out a hold on the land, partly because larger powers see it as worthless, just swamps and mosquitoes, yet perfect for their timber trade. Here no neat British town rises, no manicured gardens bloom. Instead, makeshift huts sprawl along creeks, and men live by the tide's rhythm. You notice how they eye passing Spanish galleons warily, for Spain claims this coast as its own, as part of its New World empire. Yet ironically, the Spanish presence is minimal. They send patrols and raids, but they never build a true settlement. This gap in control leaves room for the Baymen to thrive, bending British authority to their own needs. In the evenings, you sit by fires where tales of pirates echo stories of men like Henry Morgan, who sacked Panama, or the nameless privateers who turned from crown-sanctioned raiding to pure outlawry. Whether all the stories are true doesn't matter. They give these settlers a sense of legend, a reason to see themselves as survivors of storms and empires alike. They even form early councils, crude assemblies, where disputes over land and trade are settled with more rum than diplomacy. Historians still argue whether these councils mark the beginning of Belizean self-rule or just drunken meetings with accidental consequences, but the Baymen like to believe they were always masters of their own fate. The land itself seems to conspire with them, offering both riches and challenges. Dense forests yield valuable timber logwood first, then the coveted mahogany, but it's also home to snakes, biting insects, and fevers that cut men down as quickly as a Spanish musket. To work the forests, the Baymen begin importing enslaved Africans captured or purchased through brutal networks that span the Atlantic. The human cost of their enterprise grows silently in the shadows, but you sense the shift. These men cannot hold the colony alone. Their settlements swell with enslaved laborers who fell the great trees and float them downriver to the waiting ships. You notice the contradictions everywhere: freedom-loving settlers relying on forced labor, a colony growing under the watch of an empire that barely acknowledges it. Sometimes Spanish ships appear on the horizon, their cannons reminding the Baymen that they live on borrowed time. But the settlers, hardened by years of living on the edge, refuse to abandon their camps. Each time, they rebuild tighter and tougher than before, clinging to this patch of Caribbean coast like barnacles to a ship's hull. On moonless nights, you hear whispers through the trees of runaway slaves forming hidden communities deep inland, the start of stories that will shape Belize's identity centuries later. For now, the Baymen continue their balancing act, cutting timber for British markets, bribing or battling Spanish forces, and living in a land where survival itself feels like a victory. It's messy, chaotic, and utterly unlike the tidy colonies of the empire. Yet here on this humid coast, something begins to stir, an early sense of belonging, not to Britain nor to Spain, but to the land itself. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, let's ease into the story together. You sit by the water's edge as dawn creeps over the horizon, and the cries of seabirds mingle with the splash of waves against wooden hulls. The Baymen rise again with the sun tools in hand, ready to wrestle another day's living from the stubborn land. They don't know it yet, but their rough beginnings will set the stage for centuries of conflict resilience and a nation's birth. You wake to the hammering sound of axes striking thick mahogany trunks, the scent of sap and sawdust filling the morning air. The 18th century settlement is growing, though calling it a colony might be generous. Here in Belize town, wooden houses perch nervously along the waterfront, ready to be washed away by the next hurricane, yet people keep rebuilding them. The Baymen have shifted their focus from logwood, which once fetched high prices for dye, to mahogany, harder, more valuable, and in endless demand in British furniture markets. To harvest these towering trees, they rely on enslaved Africans who live in a world of brutal conditions far removed from the wealth their labor creates. You watch them push logs downriver, their bodies glistening with sweat muscles, tense with effort, under the Caribbean sun. The town feels alive with contradictions. Merchants grow rich, their pockets heavy with coin, while the enslaved endure chains both literal and invisible. Even among free settlers there is no equality. British officials and wealthy Baymen dominate trade and politics, leaving poorer whites and the enslaved with little say. Yet within the enslaved communities you sense resilience, songs sung at night, secret gatherings, and an unspoken bond that stretches across the plantations and forests. Some even escape into the dense interior, forming settlements known as maroon communities. There they carve out freedom in defiance of the colonial order, becoming whispers of resistance that frighten their former masters. Meanwhile, British rule is still strangely distant. The Crown maintains only a loose grip on this territory, officially recognizing it not as a colony, but as a settlement for woodcutting under Spanish consent. Yes, Spain still claims sovereignty here, and treaties occasionally confirm this odd arrangement. Spain allows the British to cut timber, but forbids fortifications or farming. You smirk at the irony. The Baymen ignore the farming ban, almost immediately planting what they need while strengthening their makeshift defenses. Historians still argue whether these early settlements were acts of rebellion or simply stubborn pragmatism, but either way they deepen the settlers' sense of independence. The wealth pouring into British markets only increases the settlement's importance. Mahogany furniture becomes a symbol of status back in London, polished to a sheen in aristocratic parlours, while here in Belize, workers die under falling trees or from diseases that sweep through the camps. The price of beauty is high, and few in Britain care to think about it. Even hurricanes, which regularly flatten Belize town, do not deter the loggers. You witness one such storm in the 1700s, the sea rising like a whirlwind tearing through houses, and when it finally passes, survivors gather amid wreckage, rebuilding with an almost reckless determination. Out of this chaos grows a distinct Creole identity. Children born of African and European heritage form a new cultural core, blending languages, customs, and beliefs into something uniquely Belizean. You see them dance to drums that echo both African rhythms and European melodies, a quiet act of cultural survival amid oppression. Though the colonial order tries to control them, they carve out a space that is neither fully British nor fully African, a space that belongs to the land itself. Not everyone welcomes this. Colonial authorities worry about uprisings, tightening laws to control the enslaved population. Punishments are harsh and freedoms rare. Yet the more they try to tighten their grip, the more resistance simmers beneath the surface. Runaways vanish into the forests carrying stories of hope, while others plot small acts of defiance, tools, broken work, slowed messages passed in secret. These are the cracks in the colonial machine, cracks that will widen over time. Amid this growing tension, Spain lurks in the background, occasionally launching raids to remind everyone who supposedly rules here. Spanish troops burn camps, destroy supplies, and vanish back into the jungle. The Baymen respond with stubbornness, always rebuilding, always cutting more timber. It's a strange dance. Spain claims authority, Britain claims trade, and the settlers claim survival. You can almost hear the land laughing at these competing flags, knowing it bends to no empire. Even the enslaved find ways to assert their humanity in the harshest conditions. They bring seeds from Africa, planting familiar crops in small hidden gardens. They keep stories alive, passing them to children who grow up knowing a past their masters would rather erase. These quiet acts of resilience shape a future that no plantation overseer can control. By the late 1700s, the settlement is thriving economically, yet teetering socially. Hurricanes keep striking, fires periodically level Belize town, and epidemics spread easily in the humid air. But through it all, people adapt. They have to. Life here is a constant negotiation with both nature and empire, a test of endurance that prepares this small corner of the world for the conflicts to come. As night falls, you sit beneath a sprawling mahogany tree, its massive roots gripping the earth as if refusing to let go. In its silent strength, you see the reflection of the people here, rooted, scarred, and unyielding. The air turns thick with the smell of gunpowder and brine as you stand on a sandy shore, watching sails swell against a rising wind. By the early 18th century, Spain's shadow looms heavily over the settlement. Officially, this land is still theirs. Every map they draw shades Belize into the Spanish Empire. Yet in reality, their control is as thin as the paper those maps are printed on. British settlers cut timber in defiance of Spanish authority, and with every fallen mahogany tree, the Spanish crown grows more determined to reassert its claim. You feel the tension build like a storm. Spanish raids come unexpectedly swift and destructive, forcing settlers to flee into the forests or take to the sea. Houses burn, supplies vanish, and yet, like a stubborn tide, the Baymen return each time to rebuild what was lost. These conflicts often play out in treaties far from Belize's shores. In European courts, diplomats sign agreements like the Treaty of Madrid in 1670, recognizing British settlements in the Americas, but leaving the status of Belize ambiguous. Later, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 grants Britain rights to cut logwood, but explicitly forbids fortifications or farming, a paper victory that Spain sees as temporary and Britain interprets loosely. Historians still argue whether Britain's insistence on stretching these treaty rights amounted to legal cunning or outright trespass, but the result is the same. Belize remains a contested space where laws on paper never quite match realities on the ground. As the century progresses, the Spanish crown grows impatient. You watch as Spanish troops march into the settlement during one raid in 1779, burning buildings and capturing settlers. They carry prisoners to Havana, leaving Belize nearly deserted. For a moment it seems Spanish authority might finally take hold, but the settlers, those who escape and those who are later released, return yet again, drawn by the timber trade and a fierce belief that this land, though never truly theirs, is worth defending. It's as if the very hardships of this place forge a spirit unwilling to yield to any crown. You wander through the settlement as it recovers, noticing how life resumes quickly. Ships arrive to load timber, workers swing axes under the tropical sun, and new huts rise where the old ones were ash. The Baymen are not just stubborn, they're adaptable, willing to fight with whatever resources they have. They hold informal councils to organize defense, agreeing that when the next Spanish attack comes, they will not scatter so easily. Around fires at night, they share stories of past battles and whisper plans for the future. The enslaved population, meanwhile, listens with their own hopes, some hoping for freedom in the chaos of war, others wary that whichever empire prevails will change little for them. You catch glimpses of Spanish patrols along the coast, their presence a constant reminder of the fragile balance here. Each side tests the other, small skirmishes breaking out now and then like sparks before a blaze. Even nature seems to take sides, with storms wrecking Spanish ships at times and British supply vessels at others, leaving everyone at the mercy of the sea. By the late 18th century, the conflict sharpens. Spain prepares for a decisive move, determined to erase this British foothold once and for all. You can feel the anticipation in the air, in the way settlers fortify their positions despite treaties forbidding it, and in the way Spanish garrisons in nearby Yucatan ready their troops. The Baymen's dependence on enslaved labor adds another layer of uncertainty. Would the enslaved fight alongside their masters, remain neutral, or seize the opportunity to rebel? The settlers decide to arm them, a desperate act that speaks volumes about the peril they face. Despite these looming threats, daily life continues in strange normalcy. Merchants haggle over timber prices, children play along the docks, and the forests echo with the thud of falling trees. But beneath this routine lies an undercurrent of defiance, a readiness to defend what they have built, however fragile it may be. You watch as small boats patrol the coast, their crews scanning the horizon for any sign of Spanish sails. Every sunrise could bring peace or war, and no one knows which. One evening, as the sun bleeds into the sea, you stand among the settlers gathered on the beach, their faces lit by firelight. They speak of freedom, not in the grand terms that nations use, but in the simple language of men who refuse to be driven from their homes. They are outnumbered, outgunned, and technically illegal in their presence, but they have something Spain does not: a fierce attachment to this patch of coast that feels earned rather than granted. The stage is set. Spain's claim tightens, Britain's settlers dig in, and the enslaved population quietly weighs its own chances. The next clash will decide more than who cuts timber. It will shape who controls the future of this contested land. The waves crash harder against the shore, as if echoing the inevitability of what's to come. The sky is streaked with gold as you stand on the sands of St. George's Caye, the sea, before you calm, yet holding the promise of war. It is September 1798, and the Baymen have gathered here, with their enslaved allies, knowing the Spanish fleet is on its way. You can feel the tension ripple through the humid air. The British settlers, fewer than 200 armed men, face a Spanish force that dwarfs them in numbers. Yet they stand firm, their makeshift defences braced, their ships ready to meet the enemy. This is not just another raid. This is the moment that will decide whether they stay or are swept away forever. The days leading up to the battle hum with nervous energy. Men haul cannons onto small vessels, patch sails, and sharpen cutlasses, while women and children seek shelter inland. The enslaved workers, armed and trusted for perhaps the first time, join the preparations, their resolve unshaken despite centuries of oppression. You hear them sing in low voices as they labor, a rhythm that steadies trembling hands. Historians still argue whether this battle was truly decisive or more symbolic, but as you watch these men steel themselves against impossible odds, the symbolism feels as real as the salt stinging your face. When the Spanish finally appear on the horizon, their ships rise like dark silhouettes against the morning light, sails full and guns bristling. You can almost hear the clash before it begins. The Baymen's vessels, nimble and shallow, drafted dart among the cays, using the reefs to their advantage. Spanish ships struggle to maneuver in these treacherous waters, their superior numbers hampered by the geography. Cannon fire roars, smoke billows, and the air fills with the acrid scent of burning powder. Waves slam against hulls as splinters fly, and you grip the edge of a boat heart, pounding as the fight unfolds. The battle rages for days, skirmishes stretching from September 3 to September 10th, with the final confrontation peaking on the last day. You see Spanish ships falter, forced into shallows where they run aground or retreat under relentless fire. The Baymen, driven by desperation and familiarity with the waters, press their advantage, striking and retreating like the very sea they command. Even as cannons thunder and muskets crack, there's a strange calm in their movements, years of survival distilled into this one decisive moment. When the smoke clears, the Spanish fleet withdraws. The Baymen have held their ground. It's not the kind of victory celebrated with parades or royal proclamations, but here on this small Caribbean caye, it feels monumental. You watch men drop to their knees, exhausted, some laughing, others weeping, while the enslaved fighters stand silently, knowing their courage has helped secure the settlement's survival. The Spanish never return in force, and with their retreat, British control over Belize is effectively secured, even if not yet formally recognized. The aftermath is almost surreal. Life returns to its rhythms, yet everything feels different. The settlers speak of the battle with pride, weaving it into their identity as proof that they belong here, not because an empire decreed it, but because they fought for it. They begin to commemorate the victory every year, a tradition that will grow into what modern Belize celebrates as a key moment in its path to nationhood. Ironically, Britain remains slow to acknowledge the settlement, formally treating it as a backwater, despite the bloodshed in its defense. Meanwhile, the enslaved population who fought alongside their masters return to chains, their bravery largely unrecognized in official records. Yet among themselves they know what they have done, and that knowledge plants seeds that will grow with time. Their involvement in defending the settlement blurs the rigid lines of colonial hierarchy, even if only slightly hinting at future demands for rights and equality. As you walk along the beach in the quiet that follows the battle, the sand feels different beneath your feet, like ground claimed not by treaties or kings, but by the sheer will of those who stood here. The sun dips toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash, a reminder of both the destruction and the resilience born of this clash. Though the world outside barely notices, the people of Belize Town begin to see themselves in a new light. They have survived Spanish power hurricanes and fires. Now, with the victory at St. George's Caye, they carry a memory that will outlast colonial decrees, that when tested, they can stand and fight for the land they call home. The waves lap gently at the shore, washing away the last traces of battle, but not the story. That, like the tide, will return again and again. You drift back into Belize Town, early 19th century, where the salt air mixes with the faint scent of charred wood. Hurricanes have swept through yet again, tearing apart the fragile houses, and fires have licked at the wooden streets, reducing entire neighborhoods to ash. Still, the town rises from the rubble plank by plank, as if Defiance itself holds it together. Here you sense a society taking shape, messy, layered, and deeply human. Colonial order may still dominate on paper, but on the ground it's the rhythms of everyday survival that truly govern life. The British Crown, finally acknowledging the settlement's permanence after the Battle of St. George's, Caye begins to tighten its hold. In 1862, Britain declares the settlement a formal colony under the name British Honduras, a move that places it firmly within the empire's grasp. You see the Union Jack fluttering in the humid breeze, a symbol of authority that masks the cracks beneath. Colonial officials arrive in crisp uniforms, bringing law's bureaucracy and the stiff manners of London. They impose new structures, courts, schools, and police forces meant to civilize and control. Yet behind their facade, they remain dependent on the very people they aim to rule. Walk through the market and you'll find Creole voices everywhere, blending African, European, and local dialects into something uniquely Belizean. The Creole population, descended from both enslaved Africans and European settlers, becomes the cultural heartbeat of the colony. Their music, their stories, their sense of community pulse through the streets, filling spaces that officialdom cannot touch. They face discrimination from the British elite, yet they persist, carving out their own identity in the cracks of colonial order. Historians still argue whether this resilience arose from necessity or conscious cultural creation, but as you watch young Creole children playing by the docks, it feels like both. The mahogany trade remains the lifeblood of the colony, but it comes at a cost. Enslaved workers bear the burden until the abolition of slavery in 1834, an event that ripples through Belize like a sudden gust of wind. Freedom, though celebrated, is not the liberation many had hoped for. Former slaves find themselves tied to the same logging camps under unfair contracts, wages so low they may as well still be in chains. Yet even within this system, small freedoms take root, freedom to move together to build new lives, however precarious. You walk through newly formed villages inland where freedmen establish communities beyond the immediate reach of colonial authority. Despite emancipation, inequality thrives. The colonial government favors the wealthy merchants and landowners, most of whom remain white or of mixed descent with strong ties to Britain. Creoles and freed Africans push against these barriers, demanding representation and rights, their voices growing louder as the century progresses. Meanwhile, the Garifuna people, descendants of Africans and indigenous Caribs exiled from St. Vincent, arrive on Belize's shores in the early 1800s, settling along the southern coast. They bring with them a vibrant culture, music, language, spirituality that adds another layer to Belize's identity. The British eye them warily, yet cannot deny their industriousness. The land continues to test its people. Hurricanes tear through in 1831, 1864, and again in 1931, each time leaving devastation in its wake. Fires rip through Belize town, and diseases like yellow fever spread in the stagnant waters. Yet every calamity only strengthens the bond between the people and their land. You hear laughter amid rebuilding songs sung while lifting beams and jokes traded, even in the face of loss. One man chuckles as he rebuilds his house for the third time, muttering, "Guess the storm didn't like the roof," a small slice of humour in an endless battle with nature. Through all this, the British cling to their control, even as their empire begins to wane globally. The colony remains economically tied to the timber trade, which fluctuates with market demand, leaving workers vulnerable to the whims of distant buyers. When prices fall, poverty rises and unrest brews. Small strikes and protests begin to emerge, the early signs of a population no longer willing to accept their place quietly. You wander through Belize town on a quiet evening, past wooden houses on stilts, their shutters rattling in the breeze. The town smells of the sea of smoke of life, rebuilding itself over and over. Lanterns glow in windows, casting soft light on faces weathered by both hardship and hope. You can sense it, a change is coming, slow as the tide, but unstoppable. The people here are no longer just subjects of the empire. They are Belizeans in the making, carrying within them the strength of those who have survived storms, slavery, and neglect. The Union Jack still flies overhead, but you feel that one day another flag will take its place. As night deepens, the drums of the Creole community echo through the humid air, mingling with the distant crash of waves. They beat not just for celebration, but for survival, for identity, and for a future that is slowly taking shape. You close your eyes and listen, the rhythm steady and unbroken, just like the people who make it. The 20th century dawns with the smell of sawdust still thick in the air, but you can tell something has shifted. The mahogany industry, once the backbone of British Honduras, begins to waver under economic changes, and with it, the colony's social order cracks. As logging camps grow less profitable, wages sink even further, and the lives of workers, Creole labourers, Garifuna fishermen, and Mayan farmers become harder. Discontent brews quietly at first in whispers, exchanged on porches and over market stalls, until it bursts into the open in the form of labour unrest. You hear the rhythmic pounding of feet on the streets as workers march, their voices rising in chants that rattle the walls of colonial offices. Strikes erupt in the early decades, triggered by unfair wages and abusive working conditions. The most notable flare comes in 1919, when ex-servicemen returning from World War I find themselves jobless and ignored by the colonial administration. They take to the streets demanding better pay and treatment, and the protests turn violent as anger spills over. You stand amidst the crowd, feeling the heat of their frustration, the tension thick as smoke. For the first time, colonial authorities realize the people they govern are not as passive as they once believed. These demonstrations plant seeds of something new, a growing sense of nationalism. It's not yet the fiery nationalism of independence movements elsewhere, but a quieter, persistent belief that life could be better if they controlled their own destiny. Even the humour on the streets reflects this shift. You hear a man joke, "We work like British, pay like paupers, and live like ants," and the crowd around him bursts into knowing laughter. That mix of sarcasm and resilience fuels their resolve. As the decades roll on, the workers organize. Trade unions emerge, giving structure to grievances that were once scattered. The Belize Estate and Produce Company, which dominates land and industry, becomes a target of criticism, its vast holdings a symbol of inequality. People begin to speak not just of better wages, but of justice, rights, and representation. Newspapers and public meetings buzz with debate, voices growing louder despite attempts by colonial authorities to stifle them. The economic pressures mount. The Great Depression of the 1930s hits hard, pushing the poor to the brink. Hunger gnaws at families, and desperation forces many to the streets. In 1934, a series of strikes and riots erupts, shaking the colony's fragile order. You walk through Belize town as clashes unfold, the air thick with shouting and the occasional crack of a stick against stone. This unrest forces the British to introduce modest reforms, but the changes feel like crumbs compared to the banquet of rights people demand. Then comes 1931, a year etched into memory by disaster. A massive hurricane slams into Belize town, leveling nearly everything in its path. Wooden houses splinter like matchsticks, bodies are pulled from debris, and the survivors stagger through mud and ruin. Amid the devastation, you see people helping one another, neighbors lifting beams, strangers sharing food, communities rebuilding yet again. The colonial government's sluggish response fuels anger. It is clear to many that they cannot rely on distant rulers who see them only as a line on a map. Historians still debate whether this storm directly spurred nationalist sentiment, but the feeling of abandonment lingers, adding fuel to the growing fire of self-determination. The 1940s bring more storms, both literal and political. The winds of global change, decolonization, anti-colonial movements, and the echoes of World War II sweep into Belize. Returning soldiers like those from the First World War demand respect and rights, unwilling to accept the old colonial hierarchy. Labor strikes intensify, now infused with political aspirations. Leaders rise from the working class, their speeches ringing out in town squares, stirring hearts and minds. Among them, a young George Price begins to make his mark, a name that will soon become synonymous with Belizean independence. By the late 1940s, the People's United Party is born, channeling the frustrations and hopes of workers into a political force. The PUP calls for greater self-government, challenging British authority in a way that feels unprecedented. You walk alongside a rally, the crowd swelling around you, their signs calling for freedom, their voices refusing to be silenced. British officials glance nervously from their balconies, sensing that the tide is turning. The colony remains a tough place to live. Hurricanes keep battering it, fires still spark unexpectedly, and poverty lingers, but you can feel the energy changing. People are no longer content to simply endure, they are beginning to demand. The songs sung in the streets now have a sharper edge. The humor carries a bite, and the drums beat with a purpose that feels unstoppable. As night falls, you watch the workers gather around lanterns, sharing stories of strikes, of solidarity, of a future they can almost see. The colonial flag still flies above them, but its authority seems thinner than ever, fluttering weakly against the wind of change. Under the moonlight, a worker grins and says, "One day we'll raise our own flag." You can't help but believe him. The humid air of the 1950s buzzes with anticipation, and you find yourself walking through crowded streets where speeches ring out from makeshift podiums. The People's United Party, led by George Price, is electrifying the colony. His calm but determined voice carries over the crowd, promising an end to British neglect and a future where Belizeans steer their own course. You see men in worn shirts, women balancing baskets, and children sitting on their parents' shoulders, all listening intently. It's no longer just about wages or timber, it's about dignity and identity. The British administration senses the shift. They have ruled Belize as a colony for nearly a century, but the ground is moving beneath them. Reforms trickle in: limited self-governance, minor legislative changes, but they no longer satisfy the people's rising expectations. You catch the faint sarcasm in conversations around town where locals joke, "They give us the wheel but keep the brakes." It's humor laced with truth, reflecting the growing awareness that true control remains in London's hands. In 1954, the winds of change strengthen when the PUP wins its first general election under a new constitution that introduces universal adult suffrage. For the first time, ordinary Belizeans, including women, have a direct voice in choosing their leaders. You stand outside the polling station as voters stream in, some barefoot, others in their best clothes, each carrying the weight of history on their shoulders. The excitement is palpable, even the air seems charged. When the results come in, the PUP's landslide victory feels like the first real crack in the colonial war. George Price emerges as a figure both respected and controversial. To the British, he is a thorn in their side. To Belizeans, he is a beacon of hope. He pushes for more autonomy, navigating the tricky balance of negotiation and pressure. You follow him through tense meetings with colonial officials, their stiff accents clashing with his soft but firm tone. Historians still debate whether Price's strategy was too cautious or brilliantly pragmatic, but you can see his influence shaping the path ahead. The 1960s bring further strides. In 1964, Belize achieves full internal self-government, with Britain retaining control only over defense, foreign affairs and security. This moment feels monumental, like stepping through a doorway into a new room, even if the house still belongs to someone else. You walk through Belize City, where flags wave and celebrations erupt. Children run through the streets, laughter mixing with the sounds of drums and songs. The colonial governor still resides in his grand house, but the real power now flows increasingly through Belizean hands. Still, the road to full independence remains blocked by shadows. Guatemala, just across the border, loudly asserts its claim over Belize, arguing that the territory rightfully belongs to them based on old Spanish treaties. Their stance turns every step toward independence into a dance of diplomacy and tension. The British maintain a military presence, their soldiers patrolling as a visible reminder that this is still a contested land. You hear murmurs among Belizeans, some fearful, some defiant, about what the future holds. One old man mutters, "We're not going from one master to another," capturing the skepticism lurking beneath the optimism. Throughout these decades, the PUP's influence grows, shaping a generation's aspirations. Price emphasizes unity, reaching out to Creoles, Garifuna Mestizo, and Maya communities, weaving them into a vision of one Belizean nation. You attend a rural meeting where he speaks under a simple roof of palm leaves, his words clear and steady, promising a future where every voice counts. The crowd, barefoot and dusty from travel, erupts in applause, not because they expect miracles, but because they finally feel heard. Meanwhile, economic challenges persist. Timber exports decline and the colony seeks new avenues in agriculture and fishing. Poverty remains, but with self-government decisions feel closer to home. Belizeans begin to believe that with independence they might finally chart their own economic destiny. Even humor turns political. You overhear a fisherman joke. "When we're independent, maybe the fish will listen to us too." The laughter that follows is warm, hopeful, and deeply human. By the end of the 1960s, Belize stands at a crossroads. The colonial structures remain, but their grip loosens with every passing year. The PUP continues to push, while Britain cautiously manages the transition, wary of Guatemala's looming claim. You walk through a marketplace where people talk of independence as if it were inevitable, their words blending with the smell of spices and the cries of vendors. Children grow up reciting not just British history, but stories of St. George's Caye labour strikes and leaders like Price, stories that belong to them. As dusk settles over Belize City, lanterns glow on verandas and conversations drift into the night. The sea shimmers under moonlight, calm yet restless, mirroring the colony's state. You can almost hear the land itself whispering that the final break is coming, not yet, but soon. And when it does, it will be carried by the voices of those who refused to be silent, who demanded more than crumbs, who believed they were capable of shaping their own destiny. The 1970s arrive with the low hum of unease, as if the land itself holds its breath. Belize, though self-governing internally, is still tethered to Britain, and an old claim threatens to unravel the progress made. Guatemala refuses to recognize Belize's borders, asserting that this territory is theirs by right of inheritance from Spain. Their claim stretches back to colonial treaties and legal interpretations that seem as tangled as the jungle vines creeping over abandoned logging camps. You hear the rumblings of this dispute not just in official statements but in whispered conversations on the streets. Will independence bring freedom, or will it bring war? The tension thickens with the geopolitics of the Cold War. Across the globe, superpowers play chess with nations, and Belize becomes a small but significant square on that board. Guatemala's military government leans toward the United States, while Belize, supported by Britain and later by the non-aligned movement, carefully navigates its position. British troops continue to patrol the border, a visible shield against Guatemalan aggression. You watch soldiers in khaki uniforms march under the blazing sun, their presence both reassuring and unsettling, a reminder that the colony's security still depends on a foreign power. At home, Belizeans remain determined. The People's United Party doubles down on its push for independence, while George Price works tirelessly on the international stage, seeking allies who will back Belize's sovereignty. You picture him walking the corridors of the United Nations, his modest demeanor cloaking a quiet tenacity. He speaks in measured tones, appealing not to power, but to principle, and his words resonate. Yet back home, Guatemalan threats cast a long shadow. You overhear a shopkeeper quip, "First they want our land, then maybe our coconuts," and the laughter that follows is laced with nerves. The Guatemalan government's claim is not just a legal debate, it is a looming threat. At times, troops mass near the border, creating spikes of anxiety. Belizean farmers in those regions glance over their shoulders while tending crops, their fields stretching toward an uncertain horizon. Rumors of invasion swirl whenever tensions rise, leaving the people to wonder if independence might be delayed indefinitely by the fear of conflict. Historians still argue whether Britain's reluctance to grant full independence sooner stemmed more from loyalty to Belize or fear of a confrontation with Guatemala. Despite the anxiety, life goes on. You walk through Belize City's bustling market where the smell of fresh fish mixes with spices and roasted corn. Children run barefoot, laughter piercing the heavy air, while vendors banter with playful sarcasm, "Buy now before the Guats take the price up." Humor becomes a way to cope with uncertainty, a quiet act of resilience. Throughout this decade, international diplomacy becomes a lifeline. Belize seeks recognition from other countries, building support brick by brick. The Commonwealth stands behind Belize, and Caribbean neighbors, many newly independent themselves, offer solidarity. The non-aligned movement voices strong support, while the United States remains cautious, balancing its regional alliances. Slowly, the tide of opinion shifts in Belize's favor. Each statement of support, each resolution passed, feels like a stone added to the foundation of independence. Meanwhile, the British military presence expands slightly to deter any aggression. You see helicopters buzzing over the jungle, soldiers setting up camps near the border. For some Belizeans, the soldiers are a welcome sight. For others, they are a reminder that their land is still not fully theirs. The irony is not lost on anyone. They prepare to become independent under the shadow of another country's troops. Despite the geopolitical pressure, the Belizean spirit remains unbroken. The drums of the Garifuna villages still beat, the Creole rhythms still fill the air, and Maya communities continue their traditions. In the highlands, living history every day. These cultures, diverse, intertwined and resilient, form the heartbeat of a nation not yet born but already alive. As the 1970s draw to a close, negotiations intensify. Talks between Britain, Belize and Guatemala drag on, filled with proposals, counter-proposals and diplomatic posturing. None seem to resolve the dispute fully, yet the momentum toward independence builds. You attend a public meeting where Price speaks, his voice calm but resolute, promising that Belize will not be bullied into surrendering its land. The crowd roars in approval, their cheers echoing against the evening sky. In that moment, fear gives way to pride and hope rises like a steady tide. On a quiet night, you stand near the border, the jungle alive with the chirping of insects and the rustle of unseen animals. The line between Belize and Guatemala is invisible in the darkness, yet it defines everything. You can almost feel the weight of history pressing on this unseen boundary where past empires, colonial treaties, and modern politics all collide. The moonlight bathes the trees in silver, and you sense that this land, so contested by others, belongs most to those who live and love it. By the end of the decade, the path forward is clear, even if the road remains rough. The fear of Guatemala's claim still lingers, but Belizeans have faced storms far greater than political threats. They are ready to claim their future one step at a time, no matter who tries to stand in their way. The air inside the United Nations halls smells faintly of polished wood and old paper, and you follow George Price as he strides through them with quiet confidence. It's the early 1980s, and Belize's fate hangs not on cannons or colonial decrees, but on the voices of nations. The battle has shifted to diplomacy, and every handshake, every speech matters. You watch Price address the General Assembly, his tone calm, deliberate, almost soothing, yet underneath his words strike with precision. He frames Belize's struggle not as a quarrel with Guatemala, but as a quest for the universal right of self-determination. Delegates lean forward, listening. The Belizean cause begins to capture hearts. Back home, the atmosphere is tense but hopeful. Radio stations crackle with updates about international debates, and people gather around them holding their breath at every announcement. Market stalls buzz with speculation. Will the world support them, or will they be abandoned? You overhear a woman selling plantains murmur, "If the big nations don't see us, at least we see ourselves." That sense of self-recognition pulses through the streets like a heartbeat. Support trickles in, then swells. Caribbean nations champion Belize's right to independence, their voices loud and proud in solidarity. The non-aligned movement adds its weight, pressing the case in forums where every vote counts. Even countries far removed from the Caribbean begin to take notice, drawn to the moral clarity of Belize's claim. Britain, while cautious, aligns itself with the call for independence, unwilling to be seen as clinging to a colony in an age of decolonization. You sense the tide turning not with dramatic fanfare but with steady persistence. Historians still debate whether this diplomatic push succeeded because of Price's statesmanship or because the world had simply grown weary of colonial disputes, but the effect is undeniable. Guatemala, however, does not yield easily. Its diplomats argue passionately, insisting on their claim, warning of regional instability should Belize become independent without a settlement. At times, negotiations grow heated, teetering on the edge of collapse. You sit in a room where Belizean and Guatemalan delegations face each other, the air heavy with tension. Words slice through the space like blades, yet both sides hold back from a final break. Outside, British troops remain stationed in Belize, a silent guarantee that any aggression will meet resistance. Through all this, Belizeans live their lives balancing hope with apprehension. Schoolchildren draw their dreams of a new flag, while fishermen still cast nets into the sea, their daily struggles unchanged by speeches in faraway halls. The Garifuna drums continue to echo through coastal villages, blending with the laughter of children running barefoot on sandy streets. These rhythms of life remind you that independence is not just about borders and treaties, it's about people claiming ownership of their own stories. As 1981 approaches, the diplomatic push reaches its climax. In September 1980, the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution supporting Belize's right to independence, with all its territory intact. The vote is overwhelming, with 139 nations in favor. You feel the energy surge across Belize when the news arrives. People hug in the streets, tears mix with laughter, and church bells ring out. Even amid lingering concerns about Guatemala's position, the victory in the international arena feels like a drumbeat leading to the final step. In the months that follow, preparations accelerate. Committees draft constitutions, leaders plan celebrations, and the British coordinate the transition. Guatemala continues to protest, but its opposition cannot stop the momentum. You sense a quiet pride taking root in Belizean hearts. This independence is not handed down as a favor. It is earned through decades of resilience, diplomacy, and unity. One evening, you walk through Belize City, where the sea breeze carries the scent of salt and wood smoke. Lanterns flicker on verandas, and voices rise in song, old Creole tunes, blending with new patriotic verses. Children wave small homemade flags, the colors still drying, while elders smile knowingly, remembering the long road that brought them here. The streets hum with expectation, every moment charged with the sense that history is about to turn. In the final days before the official declaration, you see British soldiers quietly preparing to lower their flag, while Belizean officials rehearse the ceremony that will raise their own. The contrast is striking, one empire fading, a new nation rising. There is no bitterness in the air, only a calm sense of transition, as if the land itself exhales after centuries of waiting. The night before independence, the stars blaze above the Caribbean brighter than ever. You stand by the water waves lapping at your feet and feel the past and future merging in the salty wind. Belize has faced storms, raids, fires, and threats. It has been shaped by slavery resistance and resilience. Now, with the world watching and its people ready, it stands at the edge of a new chapter. Tomorrow the flag will change, but the spirit that carried them here remains the same, unbroken, unyielding, and deeply their own. Dawn breaks softly over Belize City on 21st of September 1981, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink as if nature itself is celebrating. You stand among thousands gathered in the streets, the air buzzing with anticipation, and the smell of salt carried on the breeze. Today, after centuries of colonial rule, decades of labor struggle, and years of diplomatic battles, Belize will finally declare its independence. Flags bright blue with a red border, and the proud coat of arms flutter from wooden houses and market stalls. Drums beat in the distance, their rhythm steady and strong, echoing through the crowd like a heartbeat. As the morning unfolds, you watch British soldiers in crisp uniforms lower the Union Jack for the last time. The flag falls slowly, almost solemnly, and for a moment the crowd holds its breath. Then, as the Belizean flag rises, cheers erupt, filling the streets with a sound so loud it drowns even the seagulls above. The flag catches the sunlight, its colors vivid against the sky, and you feel a lump in your throat. This moment is not just symbolic. It is the embodiment of centuries of resilience. Some people cry quietly, others laugh, and many simply stand in silence, letting the moment wash over them. George Price, now the country's first Prime Minister, addresses the crowd with a calm authority that has become his signature. His voice carries across the square, reminding everyone of the sacrifices and struggles that led to this day. He speaks not just of independence, but of unity, of the need to build a nation that belongs to all Belizeans, Creole, Garifuna, Maya, Mestizo, and everyone who calls this land home. His words ripple through the air, weaving hope with responsibility. Historians still argue whether Price's leadership was too cautious or exactly what was needed, but in this moment, none of that matters. The people believe in him, and more importantly, in themselves. Even as the celebrations surge, you notice the undercurrent of challenges still ahead. Guatemala has not recognized Belize's independence, and its territorial claim remains unresolved, casting a shadow over the joy. British troops stay stationed in the country as a security guarantee, their presence a reminder that Belize's sovereignty is still fragile. Yet the mood remains defiantly hopeful. Belizeans know they have faced bigger storms than political threats. They know they can endure. The celebrations spill into the night. Streets glow with candles and lanterns, drums and guitars blend with the laughter of children running through the crowd. You taste the rich spices of street food, smell the smoke of grills, and feel the warmth of strangers dancing shoulder to shoulder. The sound of conch shells blows over the harbor, mingling with the crash of waves against the shore. There's a quiet pride in the air, a sense that this tiny nation has done something extraordinary. Amid the festivities, you catch snippets of conversations, people planning for schools, for better roads, for a future where their children will grow up free. An old fisherman smiles at you, saying with a chuckle, "We have our flag now, but we also have work to do." His words capture the truth. Independence is not an end, but a beginning. As the night deepens, you wander away from the noise toward the beach, where the moonlight shimmers on the water. The waves roll in softly, as if the sea itself is breathing with relief. You think back to the Baymen who first cut logwood on these shores, the enslaved Africans who toiled and resisted the workers who struck for fair treatment, the leaders who fought with words instead of weapons, and the countless ordinary people who endured storms both natural and political. Their struggles, sacrifices, and hopes all converge in this single moment, as if the entire history of Belize has been leading here. The independence celebrations continue for days, but the memory of that first night lingers like the aftertaste of something sweet and strong. Even with border disputes unresolved, even with economic challenges ahead, Belize stands tall, small in size but enormous in spirit. The nation begins to write its own story free from the hand that once held the pen. As dawn approaches again, you sit by the water and watch the flag flutter above the city. It sways in the wind, steady and proud, a symbol of all that has been endured and all that is yet to come. The waves whisper against the shore, and for a moment everything feels still peaceful, hopeful, and entirely its own. You exhale slowly, letting the image settle in your mind of people who stood against storms and empires and at last raised their flag over the land they call home. The celebration fades into a future that belongs to them. As the years pass, Belize's journey continues shaped by the dreams and challenges of its people. Yet whenever 21st September comes around, the memory of that first Independence Day returns, the day when hope rose with the flag and the world finally recognized the spirit that had always been there. The story of Belize is not just one of survival, but of transformation, proving that even the smallest nations can stand proudly on their own. The sea remains the same, the sky just as wide, but the land now breathes freely under its own name. And as the night quiets once more, you feel that soft truth settling in. Independence is not a moment in time, it's a heartbeat that keeps going long after the last cheer fades.